Normandy, July 1944. A young German soldier crouches in a foxhole, exhausted from weeks of fighting since the Allied invasion. His unit is collapsing around him, officers dead, supply lines cut, communications destroyed. He finds something on the ground, a leaflet dropped by Allied aircraft. It's not the usual propaganda urging surrender. This one is different. The leaflet offers specific instructions: how to gather intelligence about German positions without arousing suspicion, how to leave markers that Allied aircraft can photograph, how to safely approach Allied lines with valuable information, how to identify which intelligence matters and which doesn't. This isn't propaganda designed to demoralize. It's an intelligence recruitment manual disguised as propaganda, methodically transforming frightened soldiers into improvised spies. Over the next 3 days, this soldier follows the leaflet's instructions. He mentally notes German artillery positions while pretending to perform routine duties. He arranges rocks near his foxhole in specific patterns the leaflet described, patterns Allied reconnaissance will photograph and interpret as intelligence about German troop strength. When his unit finally retreats, he deliberately lags behind, allowing himself to be captured. But he's not simply surrendering, he's bringing detailed intelligence that will help Allied forces exploit German defensive weaknesses. Welcome to Cipher Tales. Today, we decode one of World War II's most ingenious psychological warfare operations, the propaganda trick that turned ordinary enemy soldiers into intelligence assets. This is the story of how Allied intelligence services weaponized propaganda leaflets, transforming them from morale weapons into recruitment tools. How psychological warfare teams developed sophisticated methods for identifying soldiers vulnerable to intelligence recruitment and targeting them with propaganda designed not to convince them to surrender, but to convince them to spy before surrendering. This is the story of propaganda as intelligence tradecraft, where every leaflet was a potential recruitment pitch and every enemy soldier was a potential source. The concept: propaganda meets intelligence. To understand this operation, we must first recognize the revolutionary strategic thinking that made ordinary propaganda serve intelligence purposes. This required changing how military organizations thought about the relationship between psychological warfare and intelligence collection. Traditional military thinking treated propaganda and intelligence as separate functions. Propaganda units tried to influence enemy morale, encouraging surrender, spreading defeatism, undermining will to fight. Intelligence units collected information about enemy forces through interrogation, reconnaissance, signals intelligence, and agent networks. The two functions operated independently with minimal coordination. But by mid-World War II, innovative Allied intelligence officers recognized untapped potential in combining these functions. Every enemy soldier who surrendered was a potential intelligence source during interrogation. But soldiers who surrendered passively, simply giving up when overwhelmed, provided limited intelligence. They could describe their own units, but knew little about broader German military operations. What if propaganda could encourage soldiers not merely to surrender, but to gather intelligence before surrendering? What if leaflets could transform ordinary soldiers into improvised intelligence collectors who brought valuable information when they reached Allied lines? This concept, active rather than passive surrender, could multiply intelligence value exponentially. The strategic logic was compelling. German soldiers on the front lines observed military activities daily. They saw troop movements, supply operations, defensive preparations, artillery positions, tank deployments, communication systems, and command structures. Most soldiers didn't recognize intelligence value in what they observed. They simply performed assigned duties without analyzing strategic significance. But if propaganda could teach soldiers what intelligence mattered and how to collect it safely, ordinary soldiers could become valuable intelligence sources. A private who'd never considered espionage might notice artillery positions, remember coordinates, and bring that information when captured. Information that Allied intelligence desperately needed for planning attacks, adjusting artillery fire, and exploiting German defensive weaknesses. The practical implementation required sophisticated coordination between psychological warfare units and intelligence services. Propaganda leaflets needed to contain actual intelligence collection instructions, not obvious espionage manuals that would get shot if discovered, but subtle guidance embedded within standard surrender encouragement that taught basic intelligence collection techniques. Allied intelligence organizations, primarily OSS, Office of Strategic Services for Americans, and MI9, Escape and Evasion Intelligence for British, began coordinating closely with psychological warfare divisions. Intelligence officers provided specifications about what information they needed. Psychological warfare experts designed leaflets that communicated intelligence collection techniques while maintaining plausible deniability as surrender propaganda. The leaflets used careful language encouraging soldiers to observe military positions in your area so you can provide valuable information to Allied commanders after your safe surrender. This phrasing served multiple purposes. It taught intelligence collection without explicitly ordering espionage. It framed collection as post-surrender rather than active spying, reducing danger to soldiers still in German units. And it implied that bringing intelligence would result in better treatment as prisoners. Visual elements in leaflets reinforced intelligence collection training. Diagrams supposedly showing what you'll see as you approach Allied lines actually taught soldiers to recognize and remember German defensive positions. Maps claiming to show safe surrender routes actually illustrated what intelligence about German positions Allied forces most needed. Photography showing typical Allied reception of prisoners subtly highlighted interrogation facilities where intelligence would be collected. The psychology, targeting vulnerable soldiers. Success required understanding which German soldiers would be receptive to intelligence recruitment through propaganda and how to target them specifically. This demanded sophisticated psychological profiling and targeted leaflet distribution. Allied intelligence psychologists identified several categories of German soldiers most likely to respond to intelligence-focused propaganda. First were demoralized veterans, soldiers who'd fought long enough to recognize Germany was losing but hadn't yet surrendered because of fear, loyalty, or lack of opportunity. These soldiers understood military realities and possessed valuable combat experience, making them excellent potential intelligence sources. Second category included conscripts from occupied territories, Poles, Czechs, French, Belgians, and others forced into Wehrmacht service against their will. These soldiers had minimal loyalty to Germany and strong motivations to help allies. They often occupied rear echelon positions where they observed logistics, communications, and command operations, exactly the intelligence Allied forces needed. Third group consisted of older soldiers and reservists recently mobilized. By 1944-45, Germany was scraping the bottom of its manpower reserves, conscripting men previously considered too old or unfit for combat. These soldiers typically lacked fanatical Nazi ideology, understood their unit's weaknesses clearly, and were practical enough to recognize intelligence about their own imminent defeat had value. Fourth category included wounded soldiers and medical personnel. Field hospitals and aid stations accumulated soldiers from multiple units, giving medical personnel comprehensive knowledge about casualties, unit strengths, morale problems, and supply situations. Wounded soldiers eager to leave combat had strong motivations to accelerate their journey to Allied captivity by bringing valuable intelligence. Fifth group comprised junior officers and NCOs who'd lost faith in German leadership. By late war, many junior German leaders recognized that senior Nazi command was incompetent, issuing impossible orders and wasting soldiers' lives. These officers possessed detailed tactical intelligence about German operations while having motivations to end the war by helping Allied intelligence. Targeting these specific groups required distributing intelligence-focused leaflets precisely where vulnerable soldiers would find them. Allied psychological warfare units developed sophisticated distribution strategies.
Artillery shells carrying propaganda leaflets could be fired at specific German positions identified through signals intelligence or aerial reconnaissance as containing high-value targets, reserve units, field hospitals, rear echelon logistics units, or demoralized combat formations. Aircraft dropping leaflets used intelligence about German troop dispositions to ensure leaflets reached appropriate audiences. Rather than random carpet bombing with propaganda, targeted drops delivered intelligence recruitment leaflets to specific German units where soldiers fitting the vulnerable profiles were likely to be concentrated. The leaflets themselves used psychological manipulation techniques to activate intelligence collection behavior. Appealing to self-interest, they emphasized that prisoners who brought valuable intelligence received better treatment, faster processing, and improved post-war prospects. This was somewhat true. Allied intelligence did prioritize cooperative prisoners, but the leaflets exaggerated these benefits to motivate intelligence collection. Fear manipulation encouraged intelligence gathering as insurance. Leaflets suggested that German unit situations were hopeless, that surrender was inevitable, and that bringing intelligence would provide protection during the vulnerable process of surrendering. Soldiers worried about being shot while trying to surrender might feel safer approaching with hands raised, carrying intelligence they'd collected as a peace offering to Allied forces. Social proof techniques referenced other German soldiers who had successfully used intelligence to secure good treatment. Leaflets would claim thousands of German soldiers have already provided valuable information and are now safely in Allied custody. Or, recently, soldiers from the 352nd Division brought critical intelligence and were immediately transferred to comfortable POW camps. These claims weren't always true, but created impressions that intelligence collection was a common, safe, and beneficial choice. The leaflets also taught basic counter-surveillance to protect soldiers who chose to collect intelligence. Simple instructions like observe and remember rather than writing notes that might be discovered, or count paces rather than measuring distances that might arouse suspicion, gave soldiers practical techniques for gathering intelligence without endangering themselves before surrender. The training, teaching espionage through propaganda. The intelligence-focused leaflets contained remarkably sophisticated training in basic espionage tradecraft disguised as helpful information for soldiers considering surrender. Understanding what these leaflets taught reveals how comprehensively propaganda served intelligence purposes. Basic observation techniques were taught through seemingly innocent content. A leaflet section titled "What to Tell Allied Officers When You Surrender" would list information Allied intelligence wanted, effectively training soldiers in intelligence collection priorities. Allied commanders will ask about artillery positions, tank concentrations, supply dumps, command post locations, communication lines, and defensive fortifications in your area. By framing this as what you'll be asked, the leaflet normalized intelligence collection while teaching soldiers to focus on specific categories of militarily valuable information. A soldier reading this might start noticing and remembering artillery positions not because he intended to spy, but simply because he had been told this information would be requested when he surrendered. Memory techniques were embedded in surrender preparation guidance. Leaflets would suggest, before approaching Allied lines, spend a few minutes mentally reviewing everything you've seen in recent days: troop movements, equipment, officer names, radio frequencies, supply schedules. This advice ostensibly helped prisoners provide better information during interrogation, but actually trained soldiers in intelligence recall methods.
Map reading skills were developed through leaflet diagrams supposedly showing surrender routes or Allied positions. These diagrams taught soldiers to orient themselves geographically, recognize terrain features, estimate distances, and understand grid coordinates, all essential skills for reporting accurate intelligence about German positions. Reporting formats were established through sample interrogation dialogues. Leaflets might include fictional conversations. Allied officer, where was your unit positioned? German soldier, 3 kilometers northwest of Caen, near the crossroads with the stone bridge. Allied officer, excellent. What equipment did you observe? These sample dialogues taught soldiers how to structure intelligence reports clearly and what level of detail Allied interrogators wanted. Security procedures protected soldiers collecting intelligence. Leaflets advised avoiding written notes, memorize rather than write. maintaining normal behavior, continue performing duties as usual, and creating plausible explanations for observed activities. Claim you're ensuring your own safety by knowing escape routes. These were genuine espionage security practices provided to amateur soldier spies through propaganda materials. Recognition training helped soldiers identify valuable intelligence. Leaflets would include diagrams of German military equipment with captions explaining intelligence value. If you see Panther tanks, remember their approximate number and direction of movement. This is critical intelligence. Or, communication trucks with tall antennas indicate command units. Note their locations. Timing guidance maximized intelligence value. Leaflets advised collecting intelligence in the days before you decide to surrender, so information would be current when reaching Allied lines. They also suggested the best times for observing German activities: dawn and dusk when units move into new positions, or after nightfall when supply convoys arrive. Verification techniques taught soldiers to confirm intelligence accuracy. Leaflets would suggest, count vehicles multiple times to ensure accuracy, or observe the same position from different angles to identify all defensive elements. This training in intelligence verification improved the reliability of information soldiers eventually provided. The leaflets also addressed emotional barriers to intelligence collection. Some German soldiers might feel conflicted about betraying their comrades, even if they decided to surrender. Leaflets reframed intelligence collection as actually helping German soldiers. Providing accurate intelligence helps end the war sooner, reducing casualties on both sides, including your fellow Germans still fighting. Or, intelligence you provide might prevent unnecessary battles, saving German lives. The implementation. How it worked in practice. The intelligence recruitment propaganda operation produced documented results, with numerous German soldiers bringing valuable intelligence to Allied forces after being influenced by propaganda leaflets. Examining specific cases reveal how effectively the system worked. Allied intelligence interrogators reported significant increases in cooperative prisoners willing to provide detailed intelligence starting in mid-1944, correlating with distribution of intelligence-focused propaganda leaflets. Interrogation reports specifically noted that prisoners frequently referenced leaflet content, indicating they'd read and internalized the intelligence collection guidance. One documented case involved a German logistics sergeant captured in France in August 1944. During interrogation, he produced remarkably detailed information about German supply routes, ammunition depot locations, fuel dump coordinates, and supply convoy schedules throughout his sector. When interrogators asked how he remembered such specific information, he admitted he'd found an Allied leaflet weeks earlier that explained this intelligence would be valuable. He'd spent subsequent weeks deliberately observing and memorizing logistics details, planning to bring this intelligence when opportunities to surrender arose. The intelligence he provided enabled Allied forces to conduct targeted airstrikes against German supply infrastructure, significantly degrading German defensive capabilities in that sector. Intelligence officers calculated that the sergeant's information contributed to Allied advances that would have otherwise required additional weeks of combat and resulted in significantly higher casualties. One propaganda leaflet, one receptive soldier, and the resulting intelligence potentially saved hundreds of lives. Another case involved a German medic captured in Italy who'd been influenced by intelligence-focused propaganda. He'd brought information about German casualties, unit strengths, morale problems, and medical supply shortages affecting multiple divisions. But more significantly, he'd used his access to wounded soldiers from various units to conduct systematic intelligence collection, asking injured soldiers about their unit's positions and situations under the pretext of medical documentation. This medic had essentially run an improvised intelligence collection operation for weeks before surrender, all inspired by propaganda leaflets that taught him what information mattered and how to collect it safely. The intelligence he provided helped Allied forces identify particularly weakened German units that could be targeted for breakthrough operations. A particularly valuable case involved a junior German officer captured in Normandy who'd brought intelligence about German defensive positions, artillery ranging data, communication frequencies, and command structure weaknesses.
Post-war interviews revealed he'd been recruited entirely through propaganda leaflets. He'd never been contacted by Allied agents, but had taught himself intelligence collection from leaflet instructions. He explained that reading propaganda leaflets describing what Allied intelligence forces needed made him recognize the value of information he observed daily. He began deliberately collecting intelligence weeks before his capture, intending from the start to bring this intelligence when surrendering. The propaganda had effectively recruited him remotely, without any direct human contact, transforming him from a loyal German officer into an intelligence asset purely through psychological warfare messaging.
Statistics compiled by Allied intelligence services suggested that by late 1944, approximately 15 to 20% of German prisoners brought intelligence that exceeded basic tactical information about their immediate units, indicating they deliberately collected broader intelligence before capture. This percentage was significantly higher than earlier in the war, with the increase correlating with intelligence-focused propaganda distribution. Not all intelligence collected by propaganda-recruited soldier spies was accurate or valuable. Some soldiers misunderstood what they observed, provided outdated information, or inflated intelligence value hoping for better treatment. Allied interrogators had to verify and cross-reference soldier-provided intelligence against other sources. But even accounting for inaccuracies, the volume of useful intelligence from propaganda-recruited sources justified the operation. The system worked particularly well with soldiers from occupied territories serving in Wehrmacht. Polish, Czech, and French conscripts forced into German service often eagerly collected intelligence once propaganda leaflets showed them how. These soldiers had both motivation to help allies and access to rear-echelon logistics and communication units where they could observe valuable strategic intelligence. The German response: countering intelligence propaganda. German military authorities recognized Allied propaganda was encouraging intelligence collection and implemented countermeasures. Understanding German responses reveals how seriously they took the threat and why countermeasures largely failed. German counterintelligence issued warnings to troops about Allied propaganda leaflets specifically designed to recruit spies. Orders circulated through Wehrmacht units instructing soldiers that reading or possessing Allied propaganda was forbidden, and that leaflets contained sophisticated psychological manipulation intended to turn loyal soldiers into traitors. Officers were ordered to collect and destroy Allied leaflets immediately after drops, before soldiers could read them. But these orders were impossible to enforce effectively. Allied aircraft dropped millions of propaganda leaflets across vast fronts. Collecting them all before soldiers read them was simply impractical. German officers might gather leaflets in their immediate areas, but scattered units across extended positions inevitably encountered leaflets that officers couldn't reach before soldiers collected them. German security services also attempted to identify and punish soldiers suspected of intelligence collection inspired by propaganda. The Gestapo and Feldgendarmerie, military police, conducted investigations looking for soldiers who exhibited suspicious observation behavior, taking unusual interest in unit positions, asking questions about other units, or spending time near strategic installations without obvious duty reasons. Several documented cases involve German soldiers arrested and executed for suspected intelligence collection after being caught with Allied propaganda leaflets or observed engaging in suspicious activities matching propaganda instructions. These executions were publicized within military units as deterrents, warning soldiers that reading Allied propaganda and following its instructions meant death. But this harsh response backfired psychologically. The very severity of German reactions to propaganda leaflets suggested the leaflets contained genuinely dangerous information, making soldiers more curious about leaflet content rather than less. If Nazi authorities were so desperate to prevent soldiers from reading Allied propaganda, perhaps the propaganda offered something valuable. The suppression attempt inadvertently validated propaganda messages. German counter-propaganda attempted to discredit intelligence-focused leaflets. German military newspapers and unit briefings claimed that soldiers who brought intelligence to Allies were severely mistreated despite Allied promises, that Allied intelligence tortured prisoners, and that Germans who cooperated with enemy intelligence faced post-war prosecution for treason. These counter-propaganda messages aimed to create fear that would override the temptations to collect intelligence in exchange for better treatment.
some German counter-propaganda took more sophisticated approaches. Fake Allied propaganda leaflets were created by German intelligence, leaflets that looked like genuine Allied materials but contained slightly different instructions designed to get soldiers caught. For example, a fake leaflet might suggest soldiers write detailed notes about German positions, something genuine Allied leaflets warned against because written notes would get soldiers shot if discovered. Germans hoped soldiers following fake leaflet instructions would be caught, arrested, and executed as examples. But this tactic risked backfiring. If soldiers encountered both genuine and fake leaflets and couldn't distinguish between them, they might avoid intelligence collection entirely from confusion. Alternatively, soldiers might compare leaflets and realize some were German fakes, which would increase trust in genuine Allied leaflets once fakes were identified. German authorities also attempted to create paranoia about Allied intelligence recruitment among troops. Officers warned soldiers that Allied propaganda was so sophisticated that reading it could unconsciously manipulate them into spying behavior without realizing it. Briefings suggested that even casually observing military positions after reading propaganda constituted treason because soldiers had been psychologically conditioned to collect intelligence. This paranoid messaging created unintended problems for German military effectiveness. If soldiers were warned that observing and remembering military information made them unconscious spies, how could they perform legitimate military duties that required exactly those observations? The contradiction between operational necessities and counterintelligence warnings created confusion and potentially degraded German military efficiency. Most fundamentally, German countermeasures failed because they couldn't address the underlying problem. By late World War II, many German soldiers recognized Germany was losing and sought ways to survive defeat with minimal suffering. Allied propaganda offering intelligence collection as a path to better treatment exploited real motivations that German counterpropaganda couldn't eliminate through threats or discrediting.
The ethics, propaganda as recruitment. The intelligence recruitment propaganda operation raised significant ethical questions about weaponizing psychological warfare for intelligence purposes and transforming civilians conscripted into military service into spies who faced execution if discovered. Allied intelligence officers who designed these operations justified them on utilitarian grounds. Intelligence collected through propaganda-recruited soldier spies helped Allied forces conduct more effective operations with fewer casualties. If propaganda leaflets turned German soldiers into intelligence sources, that intelligence saved Allied lives, possibly thousands of lives, making the operation morally justified by its consequences. Proponents also argued that the propaganda offered German soldiers genuine benefits. Soldiers who brought intelligence did receive better treatment in many cases, expedited processing, and sometimes post-war advantages. The propaganda wasn't lying about these benefits, it was offering real exchange, intelligence for improved conditions. Soldiers who chose to collect intelligence made voluntary decisions, knowing the risks and potential benefits. Critics raised serious concerns about deliberately encouraging soldiers to commit acts that enemy authorities would punish with execution. German military law treated intelligence collection for enemies as capital treason. Propaganda that encouraged soldiers to collect intelligence essentially encouraged them to commit acts punishable by death under the legal system they were subject to while still in German service. This criticism had force particularly regarding conscripts from occupied territories. These were often civilians forced into Wehrmacht service against their will. Allied propaganda recruiting them as intelligence collectors exposed them to extreme danger from German authorities. Was it ethical to encourage occupied nation conscripts to risk execution by following propaganda instructions? Defenders responded that these conscripts already faced danger from German military service. They were being forced to fight for Nazi Germany against their will. Offering them a way to contribute to Allied victory and potentially accelerate war's end through intelligence collection gave them agency and purpose that brutal conscription had denied. The propaganda empowered rather than exploited them. Another ethical question involved informed consent. Soldiers reading propaganda leaflets might not fully understand the risks of intelligence collection. The leaflets emphasize benefits and downplay dangers. While they included some warnings about security, the overall message was optimistic about intelligence collection safety. Were soldiers making genuinely informed decisions, or were they being manipulated into dangerous activities through incomplete risk information? Allied psychological warfare experts argued that soldiers facing combat already operated in extraordinarily dangerous contexts. The incremental additional risk from intelligence collection was small compared to baseline dangers of frontline military service. Moreover, propaganda provided soldiers with security guidance that actually reduced risks compared to spontaneous, untrained intelligence collection that some soldiers might attempt without propaganda instruction. Post-war assessments revealed unintended consequences that raised additional ethical concerns. Some German soldiers caught collecting intelligence were severely tortured before execution, as German counterintelligence tried to extract information about supposed Allied spy networks. These soldiers suffered terribly for following propaganda instructions, and Allied intelligence bore some moral responsibility for that suffering. However, comprehensive moral calculation required considering alternative scenarios. Without intelligence recruitment propaganda, Allied forces would have needed more extensive combat operations to achieve the same military objectives. More combat meant more casualties on both sides. If propaganda recruited intelligence saved thousands of lives but resulted in dozens of soldiers being executed by Germans, the net moral calculation might still favor the propaganda operation. The operation also raised questions about the long-term relationship between propaganda and intelligence. Blurring lines between these functions created precedents where psychological warfare became directly integrated with espionage recruitment. Future conflicts might see even more aggressive exploitation of propaganda for intelligence purposes, potentially normalizing psychological manipulation for espionage recruitment in ethically troubling ways. The legacy: modern intelligence recruitment. The World War II intelligence recruitment propaganda operation established principles and precedents that continue influencing modern intelligence recruitment and psychological operations. Contemporary intelligence services worldwide study World War II propaganda as recruitment operations as foundational examples of mass intelligence recruiting through psychological messaging. The core principle that carefully crafted messages can identify, motivate, and train potential intelligence sources remotely without direct human contact remains central to modern intelligence tradecraft. Cold War intelligence operations extensively employed propaganda recruitment techniques. Both CIA and KGB used radio broadcasts, printed materials, and other propaganda channels to recruit intelligence sources within enemy territories. Voice of America and Radio Free Europe broadcasts contain subtle recruitment messaging designed to identify potential intelligence sources among Soviet citizens, while Soviet propaganda similarly targeted Western populations. Modern digital intelligence operations rely heavily on propaganda recruitment principles. Social media, online forums, encrypted messaging platforms, and various digital channels now serve functions that propaganda leaflets served during World War II. Intelligence services use targeted online messaging to identify potentially recruitable individuals, provide initial contact without exposing intelligence officers, and teach basic tradecraft remotely.
The targeting sophistication pioneered in World War II propaganda recruitment evolved dramatically with modern data analytics. While World War II operations targeted soldiers based on unit types, locations, and estimated psychological profiles, modern operations use extensive data analysis to micro-target potential recruits with extraordinary precision based on digital behavior, communications patterns, online activities, and psychological indicators.
Contemporary intelligence services also learned from World War II operations ethical challenges. Modern intelligence recruitment operations generally involve more extensive informed consent procedures, clearer risk communications, and greater protections for recruited sources. While exploitation still occurs, awareness of moral problems in historical recruitment operations has influenced development of more ethical recruitment frameworks. The concept of transforming passive audiences into active intelligence sources through mass communications became fundamental to modern intelligence thinking. Rather than viewing intelligence collection as exclusively conducted by trained intelligence officers, modern services recognize that properly motivated and guided civilians can collect valuable intelligence. Propaganda recruitment operations demonstrated this principle's viability. Military psychological operations continue integrating intelligence collection objectives. Modern psychological warfare units coordinate extensively with intelligence services, designing influence operations that simultaneously degrade enemy morale and generate intelligence opportunities. The organizational integration between psychological operations and intelligence that began during World War II has only deepened in contemporary military structures. The operation also demonstrated that successful intelligence recruitment requires understanding target psychology deeply. Modern intelligence recruiting invests heavily in psychological profiling, identifying vulnerabilities, motivations, and decision-making patterns that make individuals recruitable. The psychological sophistication pioneered in World War II propaganda recruitment continues evolving with advances in behavioral psychology and neuroscience. World War II's propaganda trick that turned soldiers into spies revealed something profound about human psychology and information warfare. Ordinary soldiers, young conscripts who'd never imagined becoming intelligence operatives, could be transformed into valuable intelligence sources through carefully crafted messaging that taught them to see military value in what they observed daily and gave them practical tools for collecting and communicating that intelligence. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. Soldiers reading propaganda leaflets didn't immediately become sophisticated spies. Instead, the propaganda planted seeds that grew over days or weeks. A soldier would read about what intelligence mattered. Later, performing routine duties, he'd notice artillery positions and realize this is what the leaflet said was valuable. He'd start paying closer attention, remembering details, understanding his observations had strategic worth. The genius of the operation lay in recognizing that intelligence collection doesn't require professional training when dealing with tactical military information. Soldiers already possessed all necessary observational access. They lived within German military operations, saw equipment and positions daily, overheard conversations, witnessed movements. They simply needed to understand what intelligence mattered and how to remember it safely until they could provide it to Allied forces. Propaganda served as remote recruitment and training infrastructure. Without ever meeting Allied intelligence officers, without receiving direct orders or handler contact, soldiers became intelligence collectors purely through reading leaflets that taught them what to do. This mass-scale remote recruitment achieved efficiencies impossible through traditional human intelligence operations that require individual cultivation of each source. The moral complexity demands acknowledgement. Allied intelligence deliberately encouraged soldiers to commit acts that would get them executed if discovered by German authorities. Some soldiers died terrible deaths for following propaganda instructions. The operation saved Allied lives and potentially shortened the war, but at costs borne by German soldiers who trusted Allied propaganda promises about better treatment. Yet within that moral complexity lies recognition of soldiers' agency. These weren't forced recruitments. Soldiers chose to collect intelligence after reading propaganda that explained options. Many who chose intelligence collection were conscripts forced into Wehrmacht service against their will, using Allied propaganda to reclaim some control over their fates. The propaganda offered them ways to contribute to ending the war that forced them into uniforms. The transformation from soldier to spy didn't require betraying fundamental loyalties for many of these men.
Soldiers who recognized Germany would lose and that continuing to fight only prolonged destruction didn't see intelligence collection as betrayal but as pragmatic contribution to an inevitable outcome. They weren't betraying Germany, but accepting reality and choosing how to navigate that reality. If this deep dive into World War II's propaganda trick that turned ordinary soldiers into intelligence sources captivated you, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex, hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised by how effectively propaganda could recruit intelligence sources remotely? Can you see parallels to modern intelligence recruitment through digital communications? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? How did other nations use propaganda for intelligence purposes? The psychology of turning soldiers into sources. Similar operations in other conflicts. Share this video with anyone fascinated by intelligence operations, psychological warfare, military history, or the hidden ways propaganda serves purposes beyond obvious persuasion. Until then, remember, the most effective intelligence operations are sometimes those that recruit sources without those sources ever realizing they're being recruited, until they've already begun collecting intelligence. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.